The winter wind carried dust instead of snow that year, scratching across the empty street like something angry at the earth itself. Nothing grew right anymore, not corn, not wheat, not even the stubborn desert weeds that usually hung on no matter what. People whispered that the land was tired, worn out by too many broken hearts and too many lonely graves. Folks did what they could to survive, but sometimes doing what you could wasn't enough. Sometimes it felt like the land was swallowing everyone whole piece by piece. At the far end of Pine Ridge, near the corner where the old saloon leaned sideways like a tired man, a young woman stood beside a barrel fire, rubbing her chapped hands together for warmth. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been beautiful, once meant for celebration, perhaps even a wedding day. Now it hung loose, thin against the wind, and the tiny stitches near her wrists were torn from too much use. She wasn't from around here. Folks could tell by the way she didn't look at the ground when someone walked past, as if she hadn't yet learned that in Pine Ridge. Looking people in the eyes invited questions no one wanted to answer. Her name was Clara, although most people just called her the girl selling the ring. She held a small tin bowl filled with beans she'd bought that morning using the last coins she owned. It wasn't enough food for a week, maybe only 2 days if she stretched it. But she had a 6-year-old daughter waiting in their tiny rented room. A child couldn't survive on air. Clara had tried everything she knew, washing clothes for strangers, taking kitchen work, even picking through trash behind the saloon. But there were too many poor people and not enough bread to go around. So that afternoon, with trembling fingers, she unthreaded her wedding ring from the ribbon she tied it to and walked into town. The fire popped, and sparks shot upward into the cold sky. A group of dusty men passed by, glancing at the ring in her hand before moving on, whispering under their breath. Clara swallowed the shame burning in her throat. There wasn't room for pride when a child needed food. But still, every time she opened her palm to show the ring, it felt like opening her heart and letting strangers see how broken everything was inside her. The first man who stopped to look at the ring was the town banker, a thick-waisted fellow with small eyes that didn't match his large smile. He took the ring between 2 fingers and held it like it was something dirty. 10 cents, he said with a shrug. Clara almost laughed at the cruelty of that number. Sir, she whispered. It's gold. Looks old, he said. Old ain't worth much nowadays. He tossed it back into her hand like someone tossing scraps to a dog. Take it or leave it. She left it, even though her stomach growled in protest. 10 cents wouldn't buy a loaf of bread, and she couldn't bear the thought of giving that ring away for nothing. It meant too much. It had been given to her by a man she once believed loved her. A man who promised forever then disappeared when she needed him most. Maybe she should have let it go sooner, but she held on to it like it might somehow bring hope back to her life. Now she realized hope wasn't going to save them. She would have to save them herself. A few hours passed. The sky turned gray, and the wind picked up dirt from the fields and tossed it into the air. No one bought the ring. No one asked about her daughter. No one offered help. That's the thing about suffering. It makes people uncomfortable, and when people are uncomfortable, they walk away. Just as Clara began gathering her things to head back home, she heard the sound of heavy boots against the dirt road. She didn't look up right away. She thought it might just be another cowhand looking to waste her time. But then a shadow fell across the fire, long and steady like someone who took up more space than most. Slowly, Clara lifted her eyes. A tall man on horseback had stopped beside her. His coat was made of thick brown leather, worn around the edges like it had been through too many storms to count. His face was serious, lined with the kind of sun damage only years of ranch work could give. He didn't look rich, not the way city men looked rich, but something about him felt powerful. Ranchers didn't need fancy coats or shiny boots to show wealth. Land was wealth. Cattle was wealth. Respect was wealth. He studied the ring in her hand, and Clara suddenly felt oddly naked under his gaze. Not because he stared at her, but because he seemed to see the truth she'd been trying so hard to hide. "How much you a skin for that?" he said, voice deep and steady. Clara cleared her throat. "Enough to buy food for my daughter for a week." "How much would that be?" he asked. She hesitated. She didn't want to sound greedy. $3, she said quietly, though she knew the ring was worth much more. The man turned the horse slightly, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a folded bill. He didn't argue price, didn't talk her down, didn't smirk like the others. Instead, he handed her $5. $5 whole. Keep the ring, he said. Clara stared at the money in disbelief. Sir, I can't take this without. He shook his head gently. I'm not buying the ring. I'm helping you buy a meal. People around them watched with curious eyes. In Pine Ridge, money never changed hands without someone whispering about it. Clara's eyes filled with tears she fought hard to keep from falling. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, like that settled things, then pulled his horse around as if ready to ride off. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the tremble in Clara's voice, or maybe the desperation hiding in her tired eyes. He studied her for a long moment. You from around here? He asked. No, sir, she said. My daughter and I came looking for work. Find any? No, sir. Not yet. Another quiet moment passed. Then, in a voice strangely gentle coming from such a strong man, he said, Come with me. Clara blinked. Sir, I got a ranch a couple miles west of here. Plenty of work that needs doing. He shifted slightly in the saddle. I pay honest wages, and I don't let folks go hungry. Clara didn't know what to say. A stranger offering kindness in a world full of cold shoulders felt impossible. Dangerous even. I couldn't bring my daughter out there, she whispered, shaking her head. She's young. She needs a roof and food, he finished for her. My ranch has both. She needs a roof and food, he finished for her. My ranch has both. Clara felt her heart beating painfully against her ribs. Could she trust him? Could she trust any man now, after her marriage left scars that still hurt? The wind cut across her face, and she pulled her old shawl tighter around her shoulders. I don't even know your name, she said. He tipped his hat slightly. Name's James Hollister. Folks call me Jim. She'd heard that name before. The rich rancher with more cattle than the rest of Pine Ridge combined. The widower who lost his wife 2 winters ago. Some said he kept to himself. Others said the grief never left him. Clara swallowed hard. My daughter's name is Mary. Pretty name, he said softly. Silence stretched between them again, not uncomfortable, but full, like a moment waiting to choose which direction it would go. Finally, Clara whispered, What kind of work? Housekeeping, cooking, helping around the ranch. Whatever you can do. And my daughter? She'll be safe, he said firmly. Clara felt something warm move through her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. Maybe longer. Hope. Real hope. Jim extended his hand halfway, not touching her, just offering. Come with me, he repeated, voice low, steady. The wind pushed at her dress, but Clara didn't move. She looked down at the ring in her palm. The ring that once represented promises. Now it represented survival. Slowly, she closed her fingers around it, held it to her heart, and took a single step toward the man on the horse. Jim didn't smile, but his expression softened just enough that Clara felt like she could breathe again. They walked toward the horse together, her small body and his tall figure moving side by side across the dusty street. People watched, whispering with sharp curiosity that tasted like judgment. A poor woman and a wealthy rancher. Folks in towns like Pine Ridge were quick to build stories out of moments they didn't understand. But Clara didn't care. Her daughter's life mattered more than small-minded gossip. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of old whiskey, Clara climbed onto the horse behind Jim. She didn't know what waited for her beyond those dusty hills. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, she and Mary weren't facing it alone anymore. The horse moved forward, slow and steady, like it understood the woman behind him carried something fragile that needed protecting. Clara held onto the back of the saddle, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon was a new beginning, maybe even a future she hadn't dared to dream about in years. And as the wind finally softened and the world turned quiet, Clara whispered a promise only she could hear. "We're gonna be okay, baby. Mama's got you now." She hoped the world was listening. He guided the horse through the thinning trees while the shadows stretched long across the ground, and Clara kept her eyes forward, trying to memorize every turn of the road just in case one day she needed to find her way back. She didn't know why that thought came to her. Maybe fear, maybe habit, but it sat in her mind like a stone. Jim didn't speak much. He never seemed like a talker. He just rode steady, almost careful, like he was giving her time to think instead of forcing conversation. Most men she'd known filled silence because they feared it, but Jim rode as if silence was something he respected. After some minutes, he finally said, "Your daughter, she been eaten proper?" Clara hesitated, not wanting to admit how bad things had gotten. "I do what I can," she murmured. He nodded slowly, jaw tight. He didn't need to ask more. After another stretch of quiet, the hills opened up, revealing a long wood fence and a wide stretch of land so big Clara couldn't see the end of it. She'd never seen anything like it. Even with winter laying dull colors across everything, the ranch looked alive. Cattle grazed close to the fence line, and a couple of ranch hands worked by the barn, their figures small against the land. Jim slowed the horse as they approached the main house, a tall, old farmhouse with white paint peeling around the windows, but strong and welcoming like a stubborn old tree that refused to fall. When the horse stopped, Jim climbed down and offered Clara his arm so she could dismount without slipping. She didn't take his arm at first out of habit, but then she remembered Mary, remembered the money in her pocket, remembered the choice she'd already made. She accepted his help and stepped down. The front door swung open before they reached the steps. A woman with gray hair pulled tight behind her head stood watching. Her eyes were sharp as needles, not cruel, but curious in a way that made Clara feel suddenly very small. "Look what the dust blew in," the woman said. Jim removed his hat. "Ella, this here is Clara. She'll be helping around the house." Ella's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Is that right?" Clara swallowed. "Only for as long as needed. I won't be trouble." Ella studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Trouble usually announces itself. You look too tired for trouble." Jim glanced toward town. "Her little girl's there. I'm going to fetch her." Clara's breath caught. Would you really?" He looked at her like the question itself surprised him. "I don't leave children alone." With that, he mounted again and rode off. Clara's knees nearly gave out with relief. Ella motioned her inside. "Come warm yourself. You look half frozen." Inside smelled like firewood and biscuits, and Clara almost cried just breathing it in. Ella led her to the kitchen and put a mug of warm milk in her hands without asking another thing. Clara wrapped her fingers around the cup, letting the heat sink into her skin. After several quiet minutes, Ella finally spoke. "Jim's got a big heart," she said softly. "Bigger than he lets on. He's helped more folks than most people care to remember." Clara stared into her cup. "Why?" Ella shrugged. "Losing people makes a person see the world different." Clara didn't ask what Jim lost. She figured some wounds didn't need to be touched. When she heard footsteps on the porch nearly an hour later, she shot up from the chair before she realized she had moved. The door opened and there was Mary in Jim's arms, her little face pressed against his coat, brown hair wild from the ride. Clara rushed forward and Mary reached for her, burying herself against her mother's chest. Clara kissed her head again and again, whispering, "Mama's right here, baby, Mama's right here." Jim stepped back, giving them space. When Mary finally looked up, Jim smiled faintly. "You like horses?" Mary nodded with wide eyes. Jim tipped his hat toward the kitchen table. "There's stew if you're hungry." Mary didn't wait to be asked twice. She slid into a chair and Ella set a bowl in front of her without a word. Jim watched for a moment, then went back outside, probably to see to the horse. Clara sat beside her daughter, tears quietly slipping down her cheeks. She hadn't meant to cry, but sometimes kindness was sharper than cruelty. Cut deeper. Later, when Mary fell asleep in a small bed Ella prepared in a warm back room, Jim stood outside the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets, like he was guarding the door. Clara whispered, I don't know how to thank you. He shook his head. Don't. Just work honest and I'll pay honest. She nodded slowly. It's all I want. His eyes softened. That girl. She deserves more than scraps. A heavy silence filled the hall, not uncomfortable, but full of things neither knew how to say. Over the next days, Clara fell into a quiet routine. She swept the floors in the mornings, helped Ella cook breakfast for the ranch hands, and washed the dishes after. She mended old torn shirts, scrubbed the porch, and learned where every creak in the house lived. She didn't complain, not even when her hands turned red from washing laundry outside in cold water. Work made sense. Work meant purpose. Mary spent her days following the ranch dogs around and helping Ella knead bread dough. She laughed more than Clara had heard in months, and sometimes when the sun hit her just right, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. One evening after supper, Jim was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. Clara walked out to bring him coffee, the sky glowing gold and violet behind her. Thought you might need this, she said softly. He accepted the cup, nodding a quiet thanks. Clara lingered for a moment, shifting her weight nervously. She'd been thinking all day about a question, unsure if she should ask it. Finally, she breathed out. Why help us? Jim didn't answer right away. He leaned against the barn door, looking out across his land. My wife used to take food into town for families who came up short. Didn't matter who they were. Clara listened quietly. After she passed, I didn't want her kindness to die with her. The wind blew softly, brushing Clara's hair across her cheek. Jim continued, voice low. Some folks around here think helping others makes you weak. But I figure anyone who kicks a person when they're already down must be carrying something broken inside them. Clara swallowed hard. Thank you, she whispered. He glanced at her, eyes calm. You keep your dignity, Clara. You hear me? Don't let hard times take that from you. She nodded, chest tight. As days turned into weeks, whispers began drifting into town, about the poor woman and her daughter living with the rich rancher. Folks with small hearts always found something ugly to say when they saw someone trying to climb out of misery. One morning when Clara went into town to buy flour, a pair of women near the general store leaned close and whispered loud enough for her to hear. Ran off with the rancher, they say. Probably up to no good. Some women don't know shame. Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she held her head high. Shame only belongs to people who do wrong, she reminded herself. Feeding your child was not wrong. She walked home with her shoulders straight. That evening, Jim noticed her quietness while she scrubbed potatoes at the sink. Something on your mind? He asked. She hesitated. People talk. Jim dried his hands on a cloth and leaned his hip against the counter. People talk when they're bored. Let 'em choke on their own words. She almost smiled, surprised by the fierceness in his voice. You sure it doesn't trouble you? What troubles me, he said gruffly, is someone thinking you gotta feel ashamed of being helped. Clara lowered her eyes. Where I come from, help always had a price. Jim shook his head. Not here. Another quiet passed between them, but this one felt lighter. Outside, Mary was laughing with the ranch dogs, the sound carrying into the house like music. Jim watched her through the open door, expression thoughtful. That child's strong, he murmured. Stronger than most grown men. Clara smiled softly. She's had to be. Jim gave a small nod like he understood more than she said. Days grew longer again as winter began loosening its hold. Snowmelt trickled down from the hills, soaking the ground around the ranch. Work picked up. Jim took on extra hands to prepare for calving season, and the ranch buzzed with the sounds of cattle, dogs, and men calling instructions across the fields. Clara worked harder than she ever had, and though her hands grew rough and her back ached most nights, she felt something close to pride settling back into her bones. She was providing for her daughter with honest work, and that meant something. One afternoon, a ranch hand named Walker cornered her behind the barn while she was hanging laundry. He had the kind of grin Clara had learned to mistrust. So, he drawled, stepping a bit too close, that how you got the job? Bein' friendly with the boss. Clara stiffened, voice tight. Move aside, please. Walker laughed. Didn't mean nothin' by it. Just curious what a woman like you is doin' livin' in a big house with a rich man. Clara's breath shook, but she kept her head high. I work here. Same as you. Walker leaned closer. I heard things. Before Clara could reply, another voice cut through the air like a blade. Walk away. Jim stood behind them, face stone hard. Walker backed off with a shrug, muttering something under his breath, but he walked. Jim stepped closer to Clara, voice low but steady. He bother you again, you tell me? Clara swallowed, heart pounding. People think what they think. Jim held her gaze, eyes deep with something almost protective. A man's thoughts don't make them true. Don't forget that. Clara nodded, grateful, but also painfully aware of how rumors could spread like wildfire. Later that night, when Mary slept and the house was quiet, Clara stood by the window looking out across the moonlit fields. She thought about every fear she carried, fear of being judged, fear of being used again, fear of trusting someone who didn't deserve it. Then she thought about Mary asleep in a warm bed with a full stomach, and she knew she'd walk through fire if it meant keeping her safe. Behind her, Jim spoke softly from the doorway. You're doing good here. Clara turned. His face was gentle in the lamplight, shadows tracing across his jaw. She didn't know what was happening between them, if anything was, or if she was simply imagining something she didn't yet understand. But she did know this. The world felt less heavy with him near. For the first time since her husband walked away, Clara allowed herself to breathe without feeling guilty. Jim stepped closer. Not too close, just enough that she could hear the sincerity in his voice when he said, You and your girl, you're safe here. Clara felt tears fill her eyes, but she didn't hide them this time. Thank you, she whispered again, softer than before. Jim nodded once like a promise. Outside, the wind blew across the fields, carrying the scent of earth and cattle and thawing frost. Somewhere deep in Clara's heart, something fragile began to lift its head. Hope, maybe, or something like it. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she was starting to live again. End of part 2. When ready, say part 3 and I'll continue immediately in the same tone and style without headings. Jim woke before sunrise like he always did, moving through the quiet house with boots in hand so he wouldn't wake the others. Clara wasn't used to the mornings on a ranch, but each day she found herself rising earlier, almost matching his routine without meaning to. That morning she stepped quietly into the kitchen and found him pouring coffee, the steam softening the tired edges of his eyes. He glanced at her but didn't say much, just poured her a cup like it was already a habit he'd gotten used to. She wrapped her hands around the warm tin mug, letting heat settle into her fingers. Something about mornings felt safer than nights. In the quiet light, things didn't seem so uncertain. Jim leaned against the counter, sipping slowly as if each swallow helped him gather his thoughts. Calving season's startin', he finally said, voice low. We'll be up late nights for a while. Clara nodded, even though she didn't fully understand what that meant yet. I can help however you need. His eyes lifted to hers, steady and sincere. I know. That one sentence settled deeper than any long speech ever could have. After breakfast, Clara helped Ella prepare supplies for the long days ahead. Mary chased the ranch dogs through melting patches of snow, her laughter echoing across the yard. Every time Clara heard that small laugh, she felt something in her chest loosen, something that had been tight for too long. But peace never stayed long in a world like theirs. Rumors traveled like dust storms, sweeping across town and settling into every porch step and saloon table. Folks whispered about Clara, about Jim, about what sort of arrangement must be going on between them. Jim ignored the talk, but Clara heard pieces of it every time she went to town. One afternoon she stood in front of the feed store, waiting for flour to be weighed, when a tall woman with red hair leaned in close and whispered, Some women got ways of earning their keep. Clara clenched her jaw but didn't look at her. Silence sometimes carried more dignity than words. When she got home, Jim was tightening a saddle, preparing for another long night with the cattle. Clara hesitated before speaking. People are saying things again. Jim didn't stop what he was doing. Let em. She swallowed hard. It's about me. And you. Jim tightened the last strap on the saddle and finally turned toward her. Clara. A person who lives their life worried about other people's mouths ain't ever gonna find peace. She knew he was right, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. That night, while Jim worked in the barn, Clara tucked Mary into bed. The little girl blinked sleepily, her soft voice whispering, Mama, are we staying here forever? Clara brushed hair from her forehead. We're safe here, she whispered. Mary smiled and closed her eyes, trusting completely. Something only children seemed able to do without fear of being broken. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light across the yard. Clara went outside to bring blankets to Jim, worried about the cold. She found him kneeling beside a laboring cow, his hands gentle, voice steady, comforting the animal like it was something fragile. The sight struck her deep. Strength was easy to find in men. Compassion was rare. He glanced up when he noticed her. Shouldn't be out here this late, he murmured. It's cold. Thought you might need this, she replied, handing him the blanket. Their fingers brushed for only a second, but Clara felt warmth rush through her like a soft flame catching wind. Jim looked at her a moment longer, like he wanted to say something but hadn't found the right words yet. Then he returned to the cow, steady and patient. Clara stood watching him work until she realized she wasn't shivering anymore. Somehow the night didn't feel so cold. The next morning, exhaustion showed on Jim's face, but he was up again before sunrise. Clara brought coffee outside, and he accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." They stood side by side watching pink light crawl across the sky. You ever think about going somewhere else? He asked suddenly. Clara blinked, surprised by the question. Where would I go? Jim didn't answer right away. Just wonderin' if you miss wherever you came from. Clara shook her head. There wasn't much there waiting for me. Jim nodded slowly, almost relieved. Good, he murmured. She didn't know what he meant by good, but something in her heart answered it anyway. Weeks passed. Spring settled across the ranch, greening the fields and filling the air with the smell of new flowers. Mary spent her days helping Ella collect eggs, her little voice singing quiet songs that made the chickens tilt their heads in confusion. Clara worked until her hands ached, but for the first time in a long time, exhaustion felt like something she earned rather than something forced on her. One afternoon, while changing Mary's clothes, Clara noticed a bruise healing across her shoulder, the last of the marks from the life they left behind. The sight made her chest tighten. She kissed the little bruise gently, whispering, You'll never hurt like that again. That same evening, Jim was splitting wood when Clara walked outside with a pitcher of cold water. He paused, wiping his brow. She poured water into a tin cup and handed it to him. Their eyes met, and neither looked away. Clara, he said slowly, voice almost hesitant. There's something I've been meaning to tell you. Clara felt her breath catch. Yes. Jim looked toward Mary playing in the grass, her laughter riding the wind. You and your girl. You don't owe me nothing. You stay here as long as you need. Forever if you want. Clara stared at him, unable to speak at first. Why? Jim hesitated a moment, searching for the right words. Because a person shouldn't have to beg the world just to be treated with dignity. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. You've given us more than dignity. His jaw tightened slightly, eyes deep with emotion he rarely let show. You saved my home, Clara, he said quietly. I ain't felt a house feel like a home since... He stopped, unfinished words hanging heavy in the air. Clara stepped closer, instinct guiding her. I hope we're not a burden, she whispered. Jim shook his head, gentle but firm. No, you're the first good thing that's happened here in a long time. The wind slowed around them, like the world wanted to listen. Clara didn't know how to respond, and in her silence Jim stepped back slightly, giving her space, like he always did. That space, kind, respectful, was worth more to her than anything she owned. Days later, While Clara worked in the garden, Ella came outside and stood quietly beside her. After a moment, Ella said in a low voice, "I seen the way that man looks at you." Heat flushed Clara's cheeks. "He's been kind." Ella nodded slowly. "Kindness ain't all of it." Clara didn't answer. Ella continued, "You take your time, Clara. He's a good man. But good men are gentle with broken hearts. He'll wait." Something warm and uncertain fluttered beneath Clara's ribs, something she didn't want to name yet. That night, after Mary fell asleep, Clara stepped outside. Jim was sitting on the porch, staring out into the darkness like he was afraid the night might steal something from him. Clara took a slow breath and walked toward him. "Can I sit here?" Jim looked up, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "Always." Clara sat beside him, close enough to hear his breath, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence told the whole story. In the quiet night, with stars scattered across the sky like old lanterns, Clara realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope wasn't frightening anymore. Hope felt possible. She turned slightly toward Jim, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saving us." Jim looked at her, eyes steady, voice low. "Clara, maybe you saved me too." End of part 3. When you're ready, say part 4 and I will continue immediately in the same style, tone, and language with no headings. Lydia felt the weight of the moment as the saloon doors swung behind her, and the world outside was quiet in a way that made her skin prickle. She looked over at Grace, whose smile was small but filled with something Lydia hadn't seen on her face before, not even in the house on the edge of town. A kind of safety. The kind that came from belonging somewhere, even if that belonging was still new and uncertain. Lydia stood still for a moment, letting the warm night air brush her cheeks, her heart beating hard beneath her dress as she felt the truth of what had happened. She had defended Grace, publicly, against the same kind of place and people she had once feared so deeply. She had spoken like someone who believed she deserved respect, protection, and fairness. And somehow the words had come so naturally, like she wasn't speaking for the first time at all, but finally remembering a language she had forgotten she had ever known. Cole stepped beside her, his voice gentle in the quiet street. "You all right?" Lydia nodded, though her throat felt tight. "You didn't have to step in," she said, her voice low, almost embarrassed. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't step in," he told her softly. "I just stood beside you while you did." His eyes held hers with calm truth, and she felt her chest warm, like something inside her was slowly unlocking, one soft hinge at a time. Grace squeezed Lydia's hand, as if sealing something between them, and Lydia squeezed back, not with fear, but something close to pride. They walked back to the ranch under the quiet of early night, the sky opening wide above them like a blanket full of stars that looked close enough to touch. Lydia carried Grace to the porch as the little girl yawned against her shoulder, her arms curling around Lydia's neck. Cole lit a lamp on the porch and watched them with a look Lydia didn't fully recognize yet, something between tenderness and awe. When Grace was tucked into bed, Lydia returned to the porch where Cole stood waiting, leaning against the railing like he'd been thinking for a while. He looked over at her as she stepped close, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The crickets sang in the distance, and the quiet was strangely peaceful. Lydia finally broke the silence. "Do you think they'll talk?" she asked carefully, still shaken by how quickly her past had almost caught her. Cole let out a slow breath. "They'll talk. People always do. But it won't change what's true. You're safe here." Lydia looked toward the dark fields stretching far beyond the fences. "Sometimes safety feels borrowed," she whispered. Cole turned, his voice steady. "Then you borrow it as long as you need. And someday you'll call it yours." The next morning came with golden sun pouring across the fields, and Lydia woke to the simple sound of wind rushing through grass outside the open window. Grace was curled beside her on the bed, her tiny fingers holding the corner of Lydia's sleeve like she never wanted to let go. Lydia brushed a hand across Grace's little cheek and smiled, knowing that every day she stayed here, her daughter grew farther away from the suffering that used to shadow their lives. felt like watching dawn erase night, little by little. She dressed quietly and stepped into the kitchen where Cole was already busy with coffee. He looked up with a grin that surprised her. Gentle, warm, familiar. "Hope you're hungry," he said as he slid a plate across the table. Lydia sat, still shy in some ways, still learning to exist in a world where no one shouted at her for eating breakfast. Cole poured her a cup, and she watched the steam curl into the air before whispering a soft thank you. He nodded, not making anything heavy or awkward, just letting life be life. She liked that. She liked it more than she knew how to put into words. Later, as the day warmed, Cole took Grace to feed the horses, and Lydia watched from the porch. Grace's laughter rose into the bright morning air, and Lydia felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. Grace was learning to be a child again. No fear in every sound, no flinching, no hollow eyes watching doors. She was blooming here, impossibly fast, like a flower that had sunlight for the first time. Lydia watched Cole lift Grace and place her gently onto the fence, his hands steadying her tiny waist as she giggled. Lydia couldn't help smiling at the sight. It was so simple, yet everything she had prayed for in silence. As afternoon settled, Cole returned to the house, brushing dust from his shirt. Lydia was washing dishes, and he leaned lightly against the counter. "You're quiet today," he observed gently. Lydia dried her hands, unsure how to explain the whirlwind inside her chest. "Sometimes it scares me," she said honestly. "The quiet, the peace. I'm afraid it's something that can be taken away." Cole stepped closer, his voice firm in that calm way he had. "Peace isn't something you earn by luck," he said. "It's something you build, and you're building it every day you stay." Lydia lowered her eyes, swallowing emotion. "What if I mess up?" she whispered. Cole's voice softened even more. "Then you keep going, like the rest of us." The evening brought a cool breeze, and Lydia sat outside with a blanket around her shoulders, while Grace played with a tiny rag doll Cole had given her weeks earlier. The doll's dress was worn, but Grace treated her like treasure. Lydia watched, her heart full, until Cole joined her on the porch, his boots creaking the old boards. He offered her a quiet smile, then settled beside her. They watched the sky shift into pink and gold without speaking, as if words were something unnecessary in moments like this. Finally, Lydia spoke in a soft voice that almost disappeared into the wind. "I thought I'd never feel normal again." Cole kept his gaze on the horizon. "Maybe this isn't normal," he said gently. "Maybe it's better." Lydia inhaled shakily, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Cole tapped the porch rail softly with his knuckles. "You don't owe me thanks," he answered. "We all deserve a chance at better. I just happened to be standing there when you finally asked for help." Lydia lowered her head, letting the truth settle on her shoulders. She had asked for help, not with words, but with the desperate act of trying to sell the last piece of her old life for food. And somehow that single moment had brought her here, into a life she never imagined she might deserve. As night wrapped around the ranch, Grace crawled into Lydia's arms, half asleep and warm like a tiny bundle of peace. Cole watched them quietly before saying goodnight, and Lydia felt something inside her shift. Some soft, quiet admission she wasn't ready to say out loud, but it lived there now, unspoken and true. Days passed, each one making the ranch feel more like home. Grace learned the names of every horse. Lydia began helping with house tasks and small chores, not because she was expected to, but because she wanted to. And Cole, steady as ever, treated her with the same gentle respect every single day. Word around town continued to spread, but the longer Lydia lived without fear, the less weight gossip seemed to hold. People could talk all they wanted. Lydia had a life now, a life she was slowly choosing for herself. One late afternoon, while Cole worked near the barn, Lydia found Grace drawing in the dirt with a stick. The little girl looked up with shy pride as Lydia knelt beside her. "What's that?" Lydia asked gently. Grace pointed to two small figures she had drawn, one taller, one shorter. "That's you," she explained softly. "And that's me." Lydia felt tears sting again, but this time they were soft, warm, grateful tears. "And where's Cole?" Lydia asked lightly. Grace turned, pointed toward the barn, then looked back with a tiny smile. "He's right there," she whispered, like she believed he always would be. That night, Lydia sat by the window, watching moonlight lay across the land like silver cloth. She thought about everything that had brought her here, every hardship, every moment that nearly broke her. She pressed a hand against her heart and realized something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, solid, living hope. Not for survival, but for a life worth living. And as she watched Cole walk toward the house after closing the barn, she realized something even deeper settling inside her. Something she couldn't deny anymore. She wasn't just grateful. She wasn't just relieved. She felt something growing in her chest each time he looked at her gently. Each time he helped Grace with patient hands. Each time he treated them like they belonged. She was falling in love. Slowly, deeply, silently. And she didn't know how it would end. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was curious about it. Maybe even excited. And that was something she never believed she would feel again. Cole stepped inside, dust still on his boots, and looked at her with a soft smile that felt like a promise. Lydia smiled back, holding Grace close, and whispered a quiet good night as he walked past. She didn't need to say anything louder than that. Some feelings were too new, too precious for words. For now, she just let herself feel them. And that was enough. The following morning, Lydia woke to the soft sound of birds outside her window and the warmth of Grace tucked close against her side. For a moment, she simply lay still, listening to the silence that filled the house. It wasn't empty silence anymore. It was peaceful, lived in, like the walls held their breathing instead of their fear. She brushed Grace's hair away from her face and whispered a gentle good morning, feeling her heart ache in that tender way it sometimes did when she remembered how different life used to be. Grace blinked awake slowly, then smiled, sleepy and trusting. That smile alone was enough to make Lydia believe they had done something right just by surviving long enough to get here. Lydia dressed slowly and walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Cole already working outside like most mornings. But instead, he was at the table polishing a bridle strap, humming low under his breath. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes softened the way they always seemed to when he saw her. "Morning," he said quietly. Lydia returned the greeting, shy in that familiar way, and he slid a cup of coffee toward her without a word, as though it were the most natural routine in the world. She took it gently, their fingers brushing just slightly, and she wondered if that tiny touch meant as much to him as it did to her. After breakfast, Lydia stepped outside to hang linens in the sun. The grass swayed under a warm breeze, and the air smelled faintly of hay and dust. Grace followed her with little steps, carrying a cloth half her size. Lydia pinned the sheets with steady hands while Grace tried her best to help, her tiny fingers determined, clumsy but proud. Lydia watched her, feeling tears press behind her eyes. This was what childhood should have always looked like, soft, safe, gentle. Grace didn't remember much of the darker days, but Lydia did, and sometimes remembering made her hold Grace closer for no reason at all. Cole passed by leading his horse, and Grace called his name with a squeal that echoed across the yard. Cole smiled, slowed his steps, and tipped his hat toward them. Grace waved wildly, and he winked as he walked on. Lydia felt her cheeks warm, though she didn't quite know why. She turned back to the linens, pretending to focus, even though her heart was beating harder than it should. By noon, the heat settled heavy across the ranch, and Cole invited them inside for lemonade. Grace sat at the table swinging her feet while Cole sliced a lemon with careful hands. Lydia watched him, noticing how gentle he always was with simple things, like every movement came from a place of quiet meaning. He handed Grace a cold glass first, then offered one to Lydia without meeting her eyes. She saw the faintest shade of pink along his cheek, and she looked away quickly, afraid he might somehow see everything she was feeling just by looking at her face. Later that afternoon, clouds gathered distant on the horizon, rolling dark across the sky like they held a storm determined to reach them. Cole stood near the barn studying the weather, his jaw tense in that way men get when they're thinking ahead. Planning, protecting, preparing. Lydia approached him slowly, curious. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, glancing toward the storm. Cole shook his head. "Not dangerous, just strong. We'll tie everything down." Lydia nodded, but something inside her tightened. Storms always made her nervous. They reminded her of nights when thunder shook the house she used to hide in, nights when shouting felt louder than lightning. Cole seemed to notice her fear without her saying a word. "Nothing's going to happen," he said firmly, his voice steady like the earth. "The house is strong, and you're safe." He said it with certainty, not as comfort but as fact. Lydia nodded, trusting him even more than she trusted the sky. As the wind picked up, Grace grew restless, clinging to Lydia's skirt with wide eyes. Lydia knelt, holding her close, whispering soft reassurance. Cole hurried to secure equipment, ropes pulling tight as the storm crawled closer. The sky turned gray, swallowing the light, and thunder rolled low across the fields. Grace whimpered, burying her face in Lydia's neck. Lydia rocked her gently, her own heart pounding too fast. Cole came back inside just as the first drops of rain slapped against the windows. When the storm hit, Lydia held Grace and sat close to the wall, the sound of wind roaring like something wild just outside. Cole knelt beside them, his face calm, his eyes only on them. "It's all right," he whispered. "Storms pass. They always do." Grace clung tighter, but Cole placed a soft hand on the little girl's back, steady and warm. Lydia watched him, her heart filling with something slow and deep. She had never seen a man treat her child with such tenderness. Not once, not ever. Hours later, when the wind finally eased and the rain softened, the world outside grew quiet again. Cole opened the door to check the damage, and Lydia followed him cautiously. The land looked washed, dark and shining, but nothing was ruined. Cole turned to her, surprised. "Looks like we came out clean," he said with relief. Lydia exhaled slowly, feeling her fear dissolve like dust in rain. Grace tugged Cole's sleeve and whispered, "Thank you." Cole crouched, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "It's just what we do for each other around here." Lydia felt something shift inside her at those words. Around here, like they were part of something, not visitors, not burdens, part of a family, maybe not by blood, but by choice. That idea alone made her eyes sting. That evening, when Grace finally fell asleep, Lydia stepped out onto the porch, her heart still unsettled with the leftovers of fear and the strange new warmth that seemed to live there now too. Cole joined her without speaking, leaning on the railing beside her. They watched the night, quiet and washed clean by the storm. After a long silence, Lydia said softly, "I don't know what we would have done without you." Cole looked at the dark fields, not at her. "I don't think about without," he said. "I just think about now. And now looks better with the two of you here." Lydia felt tears slip down her cheek, but she didn't hide them this time. One fell to her collarbone, warm against her skin. Cole finally looked at her, his voice quiet and honest. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Lydia." She swallowed hard, unable to speak. She wasn't sure if she believed in forever yet. Not after everything she'd lived through. But for the first time, she believed in tomorrow. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The next morning carried the smell of wet soil and fresh air. The kind that always followed a storm and somehow made everything feel renewed. Lydia stepped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as dew clung to the grass like tiny diamonds. Grace ran ahead, her shoes splashing lightly through leftover puddles, her laugh bright enough to make Lydia forget every frightening storm she'd survived in her past. Cole was near the barn feeding the horses, his hat tipped low, and he looked up with a soft smile when he heard Grace's laughter. Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest at the sight of them together, like they belonged to a world she'd once only dreamed about. Grace hurried to Cole, tugging his sleeve, pointing endlessly at the puddles and the sky and anything else that caught her attention. Cole knelt down with patience, answering every question the child threw his way, as if each one mattered deeply. Lydia watched, leaning lightly against the porch beam, her heart softer than she ever wanted to admit. She used to imagine men as storms. Loud, unpredictable, dangerous. But Cole wasn't lightning or thunder. He was sunrise. Quiet, steady, something you could build a day around. After breakfast, Cole hitched up the wagon, announcing he needed to go into town for supplies. Lydia stiffened a little, unsure if she should join or stay, but Cole turned to her gently. "You should come," he said, not as an order, but as something close to a wish. Lydia bit her lip, memories of whispers and stares still lingering somewhere deep inside her mind. But then she glanced at Grace, who had already climbed halfway into the wagon, excited beyond measure. Lydia took a slow breath. "All right?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The ride to town felt longer than before, maybe because Lydia noticed the land in a way she hadn't before. The rolling hills, the fences stretching far like lines drawn toward freedom, the sky wide open above them. It all felt like a different world than the one she crawled out of. Cole sat close, steady at the reins, and sometimes she'd catch him looking at her like he was checking to make sure she was comfortable, safe. Every time she caught his eye, he'd give a little smile, small but warm enough to melt the coldest fear. Town was busy when they arrived, wagons rolling, boots clacking, voices overlapping. Lydia held Grace's hand tight, afraid the noise would overwhelm her. But Grace stared curiously, wide-eyed, fearless in ways her mother was still learning to be. Cole walked slowly beside them, close enough that Lydia never felt exposed. People did stare, some out of curiosity, some out of small-minded gossip, but Cole's presence felt like a shield. Not because he stood in front of her, he didn't, but because he stood with her shoulder to shoulder, unashamed. They reached a small general store, and Cole spoke to the shopkeeper like an old friend. He introduced Lydia and Grace without hesitation, his voice steady, respectful, proud even. Lydia's heart raced as the man nodded kindly, offering Grace a peppermint candy, which made the little girl beam. Lydia murmured a soft thank you, her eyes dipping low, but Cole's gentle hand at the small of her back reminded her she didn't need to hide. Inside the store, Grace pointed at every jar, every crate, every tiny object she'd never seen before. Cole let her look, let her explore, never rushing her, always watching with soft amusement. Lydia wandered near the fabrics, touching them lightly, imagining dresses she never thought she'd own. Cole approached quietly, asking if she'd like something new. Lydia shook her head quickly, embarrassed by the thought of spending money on herself. Cole didn't push, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he wanted her to have more than survival. He wanted her to have comfort. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was high, casting warm light across the street. Cole carried the parcels while Grace proudly held her candy like treasure. Lydia walked beside them, trying not to notice how natural it felt to be seen in public as a family. She dared not say the word out loud, not even in her mind for too long, but it lingered there quietly. Just as they reached the wagon, a familiar voice cut sharply through the air. Lydia froze, her heart slamming painfully against her ribs. It was a voice she hadn't heard in months, but one she could never forget. A man stepped from behind a post, her brother-in-law, rough, angry-eyed, the same man who used to stand beside her husband during those awful years. He stared at her like a ghost had just appeared. "You," he hissed, disbelief mixing with disgust. "You're alive." Lydia couldn't breathe for a moment, every fear she'd buried rushing back with terrible speed. Grace pressed into her side, sensing danger without understanding it, and Lydia wrapped her arms protectively around her daughter. The man stepped closer, his gaze burning with accusations she'd heard too many times. "You ran," he spat. "Left your place, shamed the family." Cole moved forward before he could finish, stepping between them with a calm so quiet it felt dangerous. "That's enough," Cole said, voice low, steady, firm as bedrock. The man glared, sizing him up, unaware of the steel hidden beneath Cole's gentle ways. "You got no business with her," Cole continued, his stance unmovable. "And if you think otherwise, you'd best reconsider." The man sneered, But something in Cole's eyes must have warned him, because he hesitated, just enough for Lydia to catch her breath. "She belongs with her people," he snapped. Cole took a single step closer, never raising his voice. "She belongs where she's safe. And she is." The man looked at Lydia, hatred twisting his mouth. "This isn't over," he growled before turning away, disappearing into the crowd. Lydia trembled, clutching Grace tight as tears burned behind her eyes. Cole turned slowly, worry etched across his face. "Lydia, are you all right?" he asked gently. Lydia nodded, though her entire body shook with old terror waking up again. She had never truly escaped, not yet. The ride home felt heavier, the silence deep and uncertain. Grace fell asleep against Lydia's shoulder, unaware of the storm that had just passed without rain. Cole drove quietly, his jaw tight, his eyes forward, but every so often he'd glance at Lydia, checking, worrying. She stared at the road ahead, her heart twisting with dread. Her past had found her. It was only a matter of time before it tried to take her back. But as the ranch finally came into view, something inside her steadied. Cole slowed the wagon, then reached out and gently covered her hand with his. "He's not taking you?" Cole said softly, but with a certainty that sent heat rushing through her veins. Lydia looked at him, the world blurry through her tears. Cole squeezed her hand gently. "You're safe," he whispered again. And for the first time since that man's voice cut through the air, Lydia believed him. That night Lydia barely slept. Every creak in the house felt like a threat waiting outside the door. Every wind shifting across the fields felt like footsteps coming for her. She lay awake listening to the steady pattern of Grace's breathing, trying to match her own to it, trying to borrow calm from a child who didn't know enough to fear what lived in the past. When dawn finally came, Lydia stepped quietly to the kitchen, hoping no one would notice the worry still clinging to her. But Cole was already there, pouring coffee with that familiar stillness about him. He didn't turn immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her. Not to speak, but simply to make sure she wasn't hurting alone. He handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. She looked up, ready to apologize for being scared. But before she could say a word, he spoke gently. "Lydia, you don't ever have to be afraid to tell me when something scares you." His voice was soft, not pushing, only offering. Lydia swallowed hard. "I thought he would never find us," she whispered. Cole nodded slowly. "I don't know what he plans, but he's never taking you back to that life. Not while I'm breathing." Something broke inside her then, quietly and deeply, like an old chain giving way after carrying too much weight. Grace woke soon after, cheerful and loud, bouncing onto Cole's lap as if the world hadn't changed. Cole laughed softly, lifting her high and pretending the worry didn't exist. But Lydia could still see the tension in his shoulders, the protectiveness growing stronger than she'd ever witnessed. He wasn't just being kind anymore. He was standing between her and the darkness. That meant more than she knew how to say out loud. Later that morning, Cole saddled his horse, planning to speak with the sheriff in town. Lydia stood near the barn, arms folded tight across her chest. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked, her voice small. Cole met her eyes, steady and calm. "A man like that doesn't just let things go." Lydia felt her breath tighten. Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I need the sheriff to know what kind of harm has already been done. Because if he tries anything, the law needs to be on the right side." Lydia swallowed hard, then nodded. She didn't want trouble, but she had already survived worse than trouble. Cole touched her arm lightly before mounting his horse. "You stay inside today. I'll be back before dinner." As the hours dragged on, Lydia tried to keep busy. Grace played with the dogs in the yard while Lydia cleaned and folded laundry she'd already folded twice. Ella visited, noticing Lydia's restless movements and the tremble in her fingers. "I heard there was a ruckus in town yesterday," Ella said gently. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. Ella didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She placed a warm hand over Lydia's. "You listen to me," Ella said softly. "That man Cole would walk through fire for you and that little girl. And if he says you're safe here, then by God you are. Lydia felt emotion rise in her throat, gratitude mixing with fear. She knew Ella didn't say things just to make someone feel better. She said them because she meant them. That comfort mattered. Later that afternoon, the distant sound of hooves approached the ranch. Lydia hurried to the porch, heart pounding. Cole slowed his horse near the steps, and Lydia saw relief in his face, though it was covered by determination. "Sheriff knows," he said simply, climbing down. "He'll keep an eye out." Lydia exhaled slowly. Cole stepped closer, speaking gently. "If he comes near again, we'll go straight to the law. You're not fighting alone. Not anymore." Evening settled calm across the land, warm light touching every fence post and roof edge. Grace fell asleep early, worn out from the day, and Lydia stepped outside, needing fresh air. Cole stood watching the fields, arms folded, the weight of responsibility heavy but carried with quiet pride. Lydia approached, unsure if she should speak, unsure if she would be able to speak without her voice breaking. Cole looked at her slowly, then motioned her closer with a small nod. She stepped beside him, staring out at the fading sky. After a moment she whispered, "I'm sorry for bringing trouble." Cole turned to her, surprised by the words. "You didn't bring trouble, Lydia. Trouble chased you, and you survived it." She blinked, stunned by the truth in his voice. "You didn't deserve what was done to you," he said, voice low. "And I won't let anyone make you think otherwise." Lydia felt tears slip quietly down her cheek, but she didn't turn away. Cole reached gently, wiping one tear with the edge of his rough thumb, careful and soft. "You're here now," he whispered. "That's what matters." Lydia breathed in slowly, her heart aching with something painful and beautiful all at once. She had never had a man speak to her like that. Not gently, not honestly, not like she mattered. Cole lowered his voice, steady but full of meaning. "I'll protect you," he said, "because you deserve a life without fear. You hear me?" Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle deep inside her, letting herself believe them. When she opened them again, Cole's gaze was waiting, holding hers with something she didn't quite know how to name. For the first time, Lydia didn't feel like she was hiding from her past. She felt like she was standing in her future. The morning sun rose soft and golden over the sheriff's ranch. The hills looked peaceful, almost like the land itself was finally breathing easier. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, baby Lily resting warm and sleepy against her chest. The wind was gentle today, nothing like the storms she used to live through. Sheriff Clay was tightening the saddle on his horse when he noticed them watching him. He smiled, slow and warm. "You two sleep all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Better than I have in years." Clay looked down at Lily and touched her little hand like she was made of something precious. "She's strong," he said. "You both are." Sarah lowered her eyes, shy but smiling. "We're only strong because someone finally cared." Clay cleared his throat, almost nervous. "You don't owe me anything, Sarah. I just couldn't stand watching good people hurt anymore." Sarah stepped closer, voice soft. "You saved us, Sheriff. That's something I can never forget." Clay hesitated, then spoke like the words had been waiting a long time. "You and Lily, you can stay here, as long as you want. This place can be your home, if you want it." Sarah blinked hard, tears gathering. But these tears weren't fear. They were hope, something she thought she'd never feel again. "I want that," she whispered. Clay exhaled, relieved, almost like he had been the one rescued. Lily let out a tiny laugh, grabbing Clay's finger. Clay smiled. "Well now," he said quietly, eyes warm. "I guess that means she agrees." Sarah looked over the land. Quiet fields, wide skies, a future she never imagined. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. And as the sun washed over them, she knew this wasn't just a ranch. It was home. The place where her daughter would grow up loved. The place where pain finally ended. The place where a sheriff with a broken heart decided to protect someone who had never been protected before. A mother, a baby girl, a new beginning, and no one would ever hurt them again. sheaf of rice, yellow heart.